Hi, I want to welcome you to MNST 5108 Ministry Identity and Practice. My name is Reverend Dr. Brett M. Widman, but you can call me Brett. And I want to tell you a little bit about myself since this is a class about ministry identity and practice. As you can tell, I'm male and I'm also white. And I also was born in 1964. So yes, that tells you that I'm a little bit old, depending on where you come from and what your age is as well. I'm married to my wife, Janine, and we've been married for over 33 years, and we have 4 adult daughters. Two of them actually live in Sacramento, California, and 2 of them live in Portland, Oregon. As far as my education goes, I graduated from Eastern Washington University a long time ago with a communications degree. I graduated actually from North Park Seminary in 1992, and I got my doctorate of ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary in 2012. Now, where have I practiced ministry? I've practiced ministry in a lot of places. After I graduated from North Park, I moved to Oregon, where I was the associate pastor to youth and students. Not quite sure what the difference between youth and students is to this day, but I was there for 7 years. I served for a brief stint in Washington State at Bellevue, Washington, at Newport Covenant Church. And I was there trying to figure out what discipleship looked like in a church context. And that led me to get called to Covenant Bible College up at the Canadian Conference, and I served there for 7 years. And finally from there, I ended up back in California for a brief stint in the Central Valley. Then I became an interim pastor at Stockton Covenant Church for a year. And then following that, I was the lead pastor at River Life Covenant Church in Sacramento, California. Now, how long have I been here at North Park? Well, I actually began here at North Park University in 2018, and I created a discipleship cohort for first-year students called Crux that was going to be centered around Christ in this intercultural, city-centered context. And I was there for quite some time. But then I became the director of contextual and lifelong learning and an associate professor of ministry here at North Park Seminary since 2021. I want to start off by talking a little bit about a working definition for what ministry is, what I think ministry is. We need to know, starting off like I did, who are we and where are we? Ministry is the formation of a communal sense of itself and being formed by that same community. In other words, that you as a ministry leader are joining a community already. And that community can be anywhere and anytime. And you're helping them form a sense of their self or who they are, and then you are going to be formed by that very same community. The formation happens both ways. I love this quote from Thomas Merton, and he says this: "Our vocation is not simply to be, but to work together with God in the creation of our own life, our own identity, and our own destiny, to work out our identity in God." And I want to pause here to think for just a few minutes that ministry, a lot of times when we talk about ministry, we think of it as a skill. Sure, there are things that we can do to become better ministers, where we can take all sorts of classes and lectures and read books on the skill of ministry. But what I'd like to propose in this class is that our ministry flows out of who we are rather than what we do. And we know that our congregations that we're a part of, our ministry context, will be able to discern and kind of figure out who we are based on what we're saying and what we're doing. And so it's very important for us to consider that our vocation as ministers is to work together with God in the creation of our own life, our own identity, our own destiny. In other words, we're not trying to disciple those that are in our ministry context. We are also being discipled by them as well. We work together for what God sees in us and through us from the very beginning of all creation. I love this quote from Søren Kierkegaard, And in fact, I love it so much that one of my students actually made a sweatshirt for me to put this on here, and I proudly wear it regularly. Soren Kierkegaard says this: "Now, with God's help, I shall become myself." I'm not going to be like any other minister in any other context. I'm actually called by God and the work of God to become myself. And that's actually the work of God. It's not the work that I get to do. It's actually the work that God does, that God actually one that has a vision for who we are, because he had it from the very beginning of our own creation, and he wants to bring it to completion to the very end. In other words, I'd like us to consider this when we think about who we are in ministry, that we are who we are today, and we are becoming at the same time. And this is God's work. Again, I will say it this way: we are who we are today, and we are becoming at the same time. This is God's work, not ours. This is why we need to have a growth mindset. This term I'm using lately is lifelong learning, and that's what discipleship is that we are on a lifelong journey of following Jesus for him to form us into the image that he has for us. And when we think about this, I want us to consider that when we think about identity, the only time that Satan's voice is in Scripture is actually when he's attacking someone's identity. And that should be something that we really take seriously. Now, I'm not going to bring out what's happening in Revelation, but I want to point this out in these three texts that I have up on the screen. We know that Adam and Eve were tempted by their identity. God said in Genesis 1 and 2 that both male and female are made in the image of God. They, in other words, are like God. But the temptation in Genesis 3, 5, and 6 comes with a question from the talking snake, Satan, and it says, "Don't you want to be like God?" In other words, he was creating doubt within them who they were already told that they were. That's an attack. Another one is Job. We're told in Job that Job was a righteous man. That's who his identity was. And Satan in this text goes before God and said he's only righteous because of what you've given to him. Take everything away, and that identity of being righteous will be changed. And that's what happens there. And finally, Jesus himself. Jesus at his baptism was told, when the clouds opened and the dove came down, "You are my son, who I am well pleased." God, before Jesus did anything as far as his public ministry, was told who he was. You are the Son of God. And then in Luke 4, 1 through 13, immediately after being told who he was, Satan leads him to the desert. Well, actually, it says the Spirit of God led him to be tempted or tested by the devil. And the devil uses three temptations to attack his identity. If you're the Son of God, if you're the Son of God, if you're the Son of God. God is trying to bring us to our full sense of self, and Satan is going to try to thwart that. Because if he can get it to us to question who we really are, we will start to flow out of a false sense of self, and that will not be true to who we are, especially as ministers of the gospel. We can see this go on further when we start talking about naming. And I've attached an article, actually a video in the syllabus for you to watch, that I want you to watch about naming. So in the Genesis text, God created humanity and named them good. Both, like we said earlier, both male and female are named good in the image of God. Now I want to pause here for a second. I remember in seminary when I was here that our professor, Dr. John Weborg, said that we need to start our theology in Genesis 1 and 2 rather than starting our theology in Genesis 3, because it's an issue of identity. When we start our theology in Genesis 3, we say that people are bad and sinful. I would like us to say, because of what I just said about John Weborg, that we were made in the image of God and that we are good. That is who we are. Genesis 1 and 2 starts before Genesis 3. And in Genesis 3, good humans made in the image of God choose to do wrong. But that doesn't mean that they take on the identity of sinful person. They're still good and in the image of God. So a little bit further as we go along, we see in Genesis 2 that God wants Adam of the dust to name animals. And the way that the text reads is that God would create an animal and then bring an animal to Adam to name them. And this is where it gets tricky. All of a sudden, in this process of having animals brought to him and naming them, he falls into a sleep, and God takes one of his ribs and creates woman and brings her to Adam. And he said, "You are bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." And male and female were created. Again, we get to Genesis 3. Don't you want to be like God? And again, both of them were and are like God. But watch what happens after the fall. After Genesis 3, Adam names the woman Eve. I find that interesting. He wasn't instructed by God to name the woman. She was named woman as he was named man. But after sin, he names her mother. So we are already told in Genesis 1 and 2 that she was actually a co-creator and co-heir to be stewed alongside of Adam. But then after sin, he names her mother. And in essence, a hierarchy between male and female was created. This is problematic. And if we just read, and this is a consequence of sin, the naming of other people wrongly, we can see this develop a little bit further on in Genesis 6, 1 through 8, which is this really odd passage about the sons of God taking the daughters of men. And I don't know about you, whether you've preached this before, or you've heard this before, but I've had people say that these were divine beings or like angels that came down and had sexual intercourse with women. That wouldn't work and doesn't fly. Because the way that we know in the New Testament talking about marriage in eternity and in the afterlife, sexual union doesn't take place. So I think the text is telling us something about what evolved from Genesis 3 in this hierarchy between male and female. That men actually began to believe that they were sons and created by and for God. But women were the daughters of men and not from God. So it becomes problematic that these sons of God took daughters of men. This word took is very problematic because it implies rape, that women did not have opportunity and consent on who they would be with men. The sons of God, men, took what they thought were daughters of themselves and other men, taking what they thought belonged to them. And I believe this is the great evil that was talked about right before the flood. This happened right before the flood, which would imply, the text doesn't say, that Noah and his sons did not behave this way. The great evil stemmed from the wrongly naming of women by men and their role beneath them. We can see this play out a little bit further in Genesis 11, where men said, we want to make a great name for ourselves by building this Tower of Babel. You can see from the beginning of this how if the enemy can get us to wrongly name ourselves and wrongly name other people, it's a great evil. God is the one that names each one of us who we are, because God had from the very beginning a vision for who we would become, and it's his goal to make us into that place. In other words, who we are, who are we, and who are we becoming? We actually will speak and lead and reflect out of a sense of self. So in other words, a great thing for you to consider in ministry is, do you know yourself? Not the self that you want to project onto other people in your ministry context, but are you aware of who you are? In the New Testament, we're told that the double-minded person looks at themselves in the mirror and walks away and forgets what they look like. Knowing who we are is crucial if we want to have healthy ministry. And we can't say who we are in isolation. We have to know self in the context of community. Our community holds a mirror up to us, not out of judgment, but to say, hey, this is what you look like. This is what you sound like. This is how who you are presenting is actually impacting. Your intention may be good, but your impact may be destructive or harmful for others. So who we are and becoming is extremely important when we think about our ministry that God calls us into. And where are we? We need to understand that we all speak from a specific context and be extremely knowledgeable of our own context, and understand that where we are and where we've come from might be different than the context in which we speak and minister. We need to know context, not only our own self and our own context, but the context in which we were speaking in. And if we're not aware of both those things, our ministry will suffer. This is one of the reasons why I have you read Kathy Kong, Why We Stay Silent, How to Speak Up, in her book, Raise Your Voice. This is an excellent book about voice. And while I'm not going to go over the entire book, I'm going to go over some key points in it, but you will be reading this book and you will be writing a paper about this book when you think about identity and voice. In it, she kind of covers what we've already just started from the very beginning of this course. In chapter 2, who am I? She asked this great question about how the Imago Dei, or the image of God, gives us agency and a voice. I want to say this really clearly. God, because he's made us in his image, gives us agency and a voice. God does that. We do not do that for other people. We don't give someone a voice, or we don't empower other people. That's not our job as ministers of the gospel. That's God's job. What we do is walk along somebody in their struggle to discover who they are, the voice that they have, and how they want to lead out of their own sense of self and their own agency. Philippians 2 would say, and really kind of point to this, that we don't empower other people, but as we follow Christ in the way he lays down his own authority or power, this is what we do for other people. We allow people to use the power and the voice that they have. She also points in her book that we need to be quick to listen. So, in thinking about this, I started wondering, what are the blocks or barriers of truly listening to the voices of other people? There are so many things that happen. In fact, hopefully that you took my course, the Intercultural Development module, when we start talking about voice and identity in that context. But I would like to say that I think that we have a crisis on our hand in our ministry context. we are not quick to listen. We're actually quick to speak. We're in that text, we're told to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But we're quick to speak and we're quick to become angry. What does it take for us to be quick to listen? I think we should ponder by the fact that God is a listener. God already knows the answers to the question that he poses in the text. God asks people throughout the entire Bible, from Old Testament to Jesus in the New, many, many, many questions to many, many, many people. But he already knows the answers. What God is doing is setting up a paradigm where he wants to listen to those that he created. God is the ultimate listener. And perhaps one of the things that we should think about in ministry, when we're called many times to teach or preach or lead, that being called to listen might surpass all that. That we need to understand, like God, what it means to listen, what it means to ask really good questions, and also not have a retort or an answer on the fly for the questions that we ask of people. I think not only do we need to learn to listen, but we need to learn to speak. And this is actually the ultimate quest of identity. Speaking with your own voice, speaking from your own sense of self, speaking without fear from what might come from the people that don't want to be quick to listen. A couple more things that Kong likes to point out that I'll cover in the next video is how we speak is very important. We're taught in the Old Testament to bless and not curse. And this is important for us to understand the context of those that wrote these words. There was a belief that our words had significant power in them, that when we blessed people with words, we were actually giving life to people, literal life. And when we curse people, we're actually taking life away from people. And you're human and you've lived on this planet long enough to know how painful words are that curse us from other people and wrongly naming us, and how life-giving it is when people blesses us with words of encouragement. Finally, what she does, I think it's really important, this is a really good thing for us to consider, is what social media is doing with voice. On the positive, it's really good because it's an environment and space where you can speak your own sense of truth into this space. You are free to say what you would like to say. However, it also comes with a negative, where the voices of many in their freedom are being spoken to, and there's actually real harm being done through everybody using their voices not to bless, but using their voices to curse instead. So her chapter on social media is very important for you to read. Read the entire book with this understanding about voice, who we are, and how we use it. The second book that I really have encouraged you to read is This Here Flesh by Cole Arthur Riley. And this is a book that, I don't know, it's a recent book that's really, really powerful. And if you've not bought the book already, I encourage you to buy the book, but I also encourage you, if you could, to listen to her read the book on Audible. Reading her own content is excellent, but hearing her read her content with her own voice seems transformational. And for the students that have actually listened to her read this book, they've all acknowledged that hearing her instead of just reading her was extremely powerful. She starts off by saying that identity is embodied, not a belief, but an embodied truth. Not we believe about ourselves, but actually who we are. And she's going to come at this in every single chapter that she writes about. Her chapters about dignity, place, wonder, calling, body, belonging, fear, lament, rage, justice, repair, rest, joy, memory, and liberation. And it's important for us to acknowledge her context and who she is. As a young Black woman, we need to understand what she's saying and how she's using her voice to teach the rest of us. So I want you to be really mindful as you're reading her book, and actually Kong's book as well, as they're writing about what they're writing on, to consider their social location and who they are and what they're trying to communicate to us. Can we be quick to listen to what they're saying? She also does this great work on the table. And again, in the intercultural development module, we use table as a metaphor. It's a very important and powerful metaphor for us to consider. She has Matthew 15:21 through 28 as a beautiful picture of what the table is supposed to be like. And we need to ask ourselves the question, is our ministry context the kind of table that she's describing? In the Bible, there were two identity markers for people that were there. You were either considered clean or unclean, and these are identity markers. And Jesus was really trying to help them understand this bias, because if they did not understand these identity markers that they created amongst themselves, it would hinder their ability to fulfill the Great Commission, or the covenant that God made with Abraham, to be a blessing to all nations in all the worlds. So it makes us pause and wonder. We don't use the words clean and unclean in our context today, and those are blessings or curses. We need to stop and pause. What language are we using to talk about people today? Are we using the language that every human is made in the image of God? Or are we somehow talking about people made in the image of God in a disparaging way that would identify them as not in the image of God or unclean? Table is a place. And what Jesus does in the text is he uses table over and over and over again to invite people from everywhere to be brought into this place where they can have a seat at the table. They can use their voice at the table, but there were many times in the parables that people refused. And listen to this. When there was a refusal in one parable, Jesus said, go invite the good and the bad. Go invite the clean and the unclean. They didn't have to get clean before they came to the table. They could come no matter who they were, no matter where they were, and how people perceive them. They could come to this table. And Jesus dined with everybody. He dined with those that considered themselves clean and righteous, and he dined with those that were deemed unclean and unrighteous by those that were clean and righteous. That's the first intro to this class. I hope that you enjoy being able to get into this these books, and I'm going to have you read one more video in this module as we talk about voice and identity.